Hey there, tonight we step through the gates of medieval Europe's most impressive fortresses. Those magnificent castles that still capture imaginations weren't just homes to knights and nobles, they were entire worlds unto themselves, complete with their own systems of authority, their own rules, and their own ways of maintaining order that might seem quite unusual to modern eyes. Before settling in, take a moment to like this exploration if you find it interesting, and perhaps let everyone know in the comments where in the world listening from. It's always fascinating to connect with fellow history enthusiasts across continents. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's journey together through the stone corridors of history. When picturing a medieval castle, minds often drift toward grand banquets, jousting tournaments, and romantic tales of chivalry. But for the hundreds of people who actually lived within those walls, daily life was far more complex. A castle wasn't just a building, it was a complete community, a miniature society with its own hierarchy, its own economy, and its own particular approach to maintaining harmony. These towering structures, some reaching heights of over 100 feet, housed everyone from the lord's family to dozens of servants, craftspeople, guards, and administrators. With so many people living in close quarters, methods were needed to keep order, resolve disputes, and address those who stepped outside accepted behaviour. The solutions devised were products of their time, shaped by medieval understanding of justice, authority, and social structure. The stone walls that protected castle inhabitants from external threats also contained within them spaces specifically designed for internal order. Hidden chambers, specialised rooms, and carefully constructed areas served purposes that went far beyond simple storage or accommodation. Walking through a medieval castle meant passing by doorways that led to the machinery of medieval justice, often without even knowing it. Tonight's journey explores not battles or sieges, but the quieter, more contemplative story of how these self-contained communities managed themselves. It's a window into medieval thinking, medieval architecture, and the everyday reality of castle life that rarely makes it into the romantic tales. So let's begin where every castle story must start, with the stones themselves. Medieval castles were masterpieces of intentional design. Every tower, every corridor, every chamber served a specific purpose in the grand machinery of feudal life. But beyond the great halls and private chambers, beyond the kitchens and chapels, there existed spaces that modern visitors often pass without a second glance. These rooms, tucked into basements, built into tower walls or hidden beneath staircases, formed an essential part of castle function. The undercrofts, those vaulted chambers beneath the main floors, served multiple purposes. Some stored wine and provisions, others, particularly those furthest from the warmth of the great hearth, found different uses. Cool, dark, and naturally isolated from the bustle of daily castle life, these spaces provided quiet, contemplative environments separate from the main household. Castle designers understood sound and light in ways that might surprise modern architects. Thick stone walls didn't just provide defence against attackers, they created acoustic separation, allowing different activities to proceed without disturbing one another. A chamber built into the lower levels of a tower surrounded by several feet of solid stone existed in its own world of muffled silence. Many castles incorporated small chambers directly into the thickness of their walls. These spaces, sometimes no larger than a modest closet, appeared throughout the structure. Some served as storage for valuables, others provided private spaces for contemplation or discussion. Their locations, built into the very bones of the castle, made them naturally secure and isolated. The vertical nature of castles added another dimension. Multiple stories connected by narrow spiral staircases meant that activities on one level remained largely unknown to those above or below. The Great Hall might ring with music and conversation while, several floors down, entirely different matters proceeded in near-complete isolation. This architectural separation allowed castles to function as multiple worlds stacked atop one another. Doorways throughout castles varied dramatically in size and strength. While main entrances featured grand wooden doors reinforced with iron, smaller passages often had much heavier barriers. Some interior doors, particularly those leading to storage areas or specialised chambers, were built with remarkable solidity. Oak planks several inches thick, crossed with iron bands and secured with multiple bolts, created barriers as formidable as any exterior defence. Lighting, or rather the lack of it, played a crucial role in castle design. While main living areas featured windows and were illuminated by candles and torches, many chambers existed in near-permanent dimness. Narrow arrow slits might provide minimal light, but thick walls and small openings meant that many spaces remained shadowy, even during daylight hours. This natural darkness lent certain areas a sense of separation from the vibrant life of the castle above. Ventilation too varied throughout the structure. Great halls had high ceilings and multiple openings to carry away smoke from hearths and allow fresh air. But lower chambers, particularly those built into foundations or tower bases, relied on minimal airflow. Small vents or gaps in stonework provided just enough circulation to prevent complete stagnation, but these spaces remained notably cooler and damper than rooms above. The stonework itself told stories. Rough-hewn blocks in lower levels contrasted with the more finished surfaces of living quarters. These foundational chambers, built first and bearing the weight of everything above, were constructed for pure functionality rather than appearance. Their walls, thick enough to support tons of stone, created spaces that felt almost cave-like in their solidity and permanence. Water, that essential element of castle life, had its own complex journey through these structures. Wells, cisterns and drainage systems formed hidden networks beneath floors and within walls. Some chambers featured small channels cut into their stone floors, allowing water to drain away. Others remained notably dry, their elevation or design keeping them free from the dampness that plagued lower levels. Castle designers also understood the psychology of space. Narrow corridors, low ceilings in transitional areas, and the strategic placement of heavy doors created experiences of compression and release as one moved through the structure. Descending a tight spiral staircase, passing through a low doorway, and entering a small chamber produced a very different feeling than walking through the soaring spaces of a great hall. These architectural features weren't accidental. Medieval builders, working without modern blueprints, but with centuries of accumulated knowledge, created structures that served every conceivable need of castle life. The stones they laid, the spaces they carved, and the systems they built formed environments perfectly suited to their intended purposes, whether storing grain, housing families, or maintaining the order upon which feudal society depended. Within castle walls, authority flowed downward in a carefully structured pyramid. At the peak sat the lord, whose word carried the weight of law within his domain. Below him, a network of officials and administrators managed different aspects of castle life, each with their own sphere of influence and responsibility. Understanding this hierarchy is essential to understanding how medieval justice functioned in practice. The lord himself rarely involved himself in minor matters. His concerns centred on major decisions, disputes between important vassals, and cases involving serious breaches of order. For everyday matters, he delegated authority to trusted officials, creating layers of jurisdiction that handled different levels of transgression. This system, while complex, allowed large castle communities to function with surprising efficiency. The steward or seneschal stood as the lord's primary representative in matters of household management. This official oversaw everything from food supplies to staff discipline, holding significant authority over the daily lives of everyone who served the castle. The steward could address minor infractions immediately, implementing corrections without bothering the lord with trivial matters. His word, in most cases, was final. Constables commanded the castle's military forces, managing guards, maintaining defensive readiness and ensuring security. Their jurisdiction extended to matters of castle defence, the conduct of soldiers, and the oversight of areas related to military function. A constable's authority was particularly strong in matters involving the garrison, where maintaining discipline was considered essential to castle safety. The marshal handled stables, horses, and everything related to the castle's mounted forces. This might seem a narrow responsibility, but horses represented enormous wealth and military power. The marshal's authority included managing grooms, maintaining equipment, and addressing any issues related to this vital aspect of castle operations. Horse theft or mistreatment fell squarely within the marshal's purview. Bailiffs managed the lord's lands beyond the castle walls, but their authority often extended to certain castle matters as well. They collected rents, supervised agricultural activities, and addressed disputes among the peasants and tenant farmers whose labour supported the entire feudal structure. When country folk came to the castle for justice, they often found themselves before the bailiff. Below these major officials, a network of lesser authorities managed specific areas. The master of the wardrobe controlled clothing and textiles. The clerk of the kitchen oversaw food preparation. The porter managed the gates. Each held limited authority within their domain, able to address minor issues but expected to defer to higher authorities for more significant matters. This layered system meant that justice in a castle was rarely a simple matter of crime and consequence. Instead, it involved considerations of social rank, the specific nature of the transgression, and which official held jurisdiction. A servant who stole food might face one response if caught by the kitchen clerk, but a different one if the matter reached the steward. A guard who fell asleep on duty answered to the constable, not through the same channels as a groom who neglected horses. Medieval understanding of justice also incorporated concepts that seem unusual to modern sensibilities. The idea of maintaining honour, preserving social order, and upholding the established hierarchy often mattered as much as the specific act committed. Someone who showed disrespect to authority might face more serious consequences than someone who committed a minor theft while remaining appropriately deferential. Social rank played an enormous role in determining outcomes. A knight who committed an infraction would be handled very differently than a servant who did the same thing. This wasn't seen as unfairness, but as recognition of different roles and responsibilities within the social structure. Knights had status to maintain and families to represent. Servants had neither, and expectations for their behaviour differed accordingly. The Lord's justice also extended to those who lived on his lands outside the castle walls, peasants who farmed his fields, merchants who traded in his market town, and craftspeople who worked under his protection all fell under his jurisdiction. The castle thus served as a centre of justice not just for its immediate inhabitants, but for the entire surrounding community. Religious considerations complicated matters further. The medieval church maintained its own system of justice for clerics, and matters it considered spiritual. Castle chaplains, while living within the Lord's domain, answered to ecclesiastical authority. This created occasional tensions when church law and secular authority came into conflict, though most lords and bishops worked to maintain harmonious relations. Women in castles occupied a complex position in this hierarchy. The lady of the castle held significant authority over household matters and could make binding decisions about servants and domestic issues. However, her authority operated within carefully defined bounds, and matters beyond the household sphere typically fell to male officials. Noblewomen could be remarkably powerful within their proper sphere, managing large staffs and wielding influence that extended far beyond the castle walls. Children of noble families existed in a protected category, their transgressions generally handled privately within their families, rather than through the official justice system. A lord's son who misbehaved might face consequences from his father or his appointed tutors, but the formal machinery of castle justice rarely touched those of noble blood. This protection extended to a degree to the children of higher servants as well, though with less certainty. The jurisdiction of castle justice had clear geographic limits. A lord's authority extended to his lands and those who lived upon them, but beyond those boundaries lay the domains of other lords. Fugitives who escaped beyond the border of a lord's lands entered a different jurisdiction, though agreements between nobles often allowed for cooperation in pursuing serious offenders. This complex web of authority, jurisdiction, and social hierarchy created a system that, for all its apparent complexity, functioned smoothly in most cases. Everyone understood their place, knew which authorities governed which aspects of life, and recognized the consequences of stepping outside accepted bounds. It was a world built on clear expectations, well-defined roles, and the understanding that order, above all else, must be maintained. Medieval castle communities employed a range of approaches to address those who stepped outside accepted behaviour. These methods, developed over centuries and influenced by everything from Roman law to Christian theology, reflected medieval understanding of human nature, social order, and the maintenance of harmony within close-knit communities. The simplest response to minor infractions was public acknowledgement. When someone committed a small transgression, they might be required to stand in a prominent location and verbally admit their error. This practice, known as public penance, served multiple purposes. It reminded the community of expected standards, demonstrated that consequences followed misbehaviour, and allowed the transgressor to formally rejoin the community in good standing. The embarrassment involved was considered sufficient correction for minor matters. Fines represented another common approach, particularly for those with means to pay them. A servant who damaged property might forfeit a portion of their wages. A merchant who violated market regulations could face monetary penalties. These fines served practical purposes, compensating for losses or funding castle operations, while also creating a consequence that most people wish to avoid. The amounts varied based on both the infraction and the financial circumstances of those involved. Restriction of movement offered another tool for managing behaviour. Someone who caused problems might find themselves confined to specific areas of the castle for a set period. They could perform their duties but weren't permitted to join communal meals, attend entertainments, or move freely through the castle. This social isolation, while not physically restrictive, created a powerful incentive to maintain proper behaviour in the future. Loss of privileges struck at the heart of castle life's hierarchical nature. Everyone, from nobles to servants, enjoyed certain benefits appropriate to their station. A guard who neglected duties might lose the privilege of dining in the hall, instead taking meals alone. A servant might forfeit their small private sleeping space and return to communal quarters. These adjustments in status, while seemingly minor, carried significant weight in a world where position and privilege defined daily experience. Extra duties served both practical and corrective purposes. Someone who created problems might find themselves assigned additional work, performing tasks beyond their normal responsibilities. A groom might spend extra hours mucking stables. A kitchen worker might take on the least pleasant cleaning tasks. This approach reinforced that transgressions had consequences, while also benefiting the castle household through the additional labour. Public labour, performed in view of the community, added an element of acknowledgement to the extra work. Rather than simply doing more tasks, the person might be assigned highly visible responsibilities that everyone could see. This served as both correction and reminder, showing others that misbehaviour led to undesirable outcomes. The visibility was part of the consequence, not merely a side effect. Banishment from the castle represented one of the most serious responses available. For someone whose entire life centred on the castle community, being sent away meant losing employment, community, and often the only home they'd known. This consequence was reserved for serious or repeated transgressions, situations where maintaining the person within the community seemed impossible or unwise. Banishment effectively removed the problem by removing the person. For those of higher status, knights and minor nobles, different approaches applied. These individuals couldn't simply be sent away or assigned extra duties like common servants. Instead, they might face loss of specific privileges, temporary removal from certain councils or gatherings, or requirements to make public apologies or restitution. Their position demanded different handling, though consequences still followed their actions. Stocks and pillories, wooden devices that held people in public places, appeared in many castle courtyards and nearby town squares. These contraptions, designed to hold someone in an uncomfortable position while exposing them to public view, served more as community reminder than anything else. People passing by would see the person confined, understanding that this resulted from unacceptable behaviour. The duration of time spent in these devices varied based on the nature of the transgression. Some castles employed specialised chambers for temporary confinement. These spaces, often small rooms with solid doors and minimal furnishings, provided isolation without the complexity of more elaborate arrangements. Someone might spend hours or days in such a space, with basic food and water provided, simply separated from the normal flow of castle life. The isolation itself served as both consequence and cooling-off period. Medieval understanding of correction also incorporated spiritual elements. Castle chaplains played important roles in addressing behaviour, particularly matters considered moral or spiritual in nature. Someone who committed certain transgressions might be required to perform extended prayers, undertake fasts, or engage in other religious practices intended to encourage reflection and improvement. These spiritual corrections often accompanied other consequences. The concept of surety, or guarantee of future good behaviour, appeared frequently in medieval justice. Someone who committed an infraction might be required to provide surety, essentially a promise backed by something of value. They might pledge a sum of money, held by the castle, which would be forfeit if further problems occurred. This created a concrete incentive for improved behaviour. restitution played a central role when transgressions involved property or direct harm to others. If someone damaged belongings, stole items, or caused loss to another person, they were expected to make things right. This might involve replacing items, performing work to compensate for losses, or providing something of equivalent value. The focus was on restoring balance rather than simply imposing consequences. Community service, though not called by that name, existed in medieval practice. Someone who committed an infraction might be required to perform specific tasks for the community's benefit. This could include repairing common areas, assisting with large projects, or helping individuals in need. The work served practical purposes while also allowing the person to demonstrate commitment to the community's welfare. Public apologies, carefully structured and formally delivered, represented important tools for restoring social harmony. These weren't casual expressions of regret, but formal statements made before witnesses, often following specific formulas. The person would acknowledge their error, accept responsibility, express regret, and pledge future proper behaviour. These ritualised apologies served to officially close the matter and allow everyone to move forward. Mediation and arbitration, overseen by respected castle officials or occasionally the lord himself, helped resolve disputes before they escalated. Rather than imposing consequences, these processes sought to find solutions acceptable to all parties. The neutral authority would hear both sides, consider the circumstances, and propose a resolution. This approach prevented many situations from requiring more serious intervention. For the youngest members of castle communities, correction often took educational forms. Children of servants or lesser nobles who misbehaved might be assigned to additional lessons, required to memorise texts, or given extra instruction in proper behaviour. The emphasis was on teaching rather than simple consequence, reflecting understanding that young people were still learning their roles in society. The role of shame in medieval justice cannot be overstated. In close-knit communities where reputation mattered enormously, public knowledge of misbehaviour carried significant weight. Many consequences emphasised the public nature of the response precisely because this social dimension provided powerful motivation for future proper behaviour. Being known as someone who had required correction shaped how others viewed and interacted with that person. Temporary loss of trust marked another consequence, perhaps more subtle but deeply felt. Someone who violated expectations might find themselves no longer trusted with certain responsibilities or included in particular activities. This wasn't formally imposed, but rather emerged naturally from the reality of broken trust. Rebuilding that trust required sustained demonstration of improved behaviour over time. These varied approaches created a toolkit that castle authorities could apply with considerable flexibility. The specific response to any situation depended on multiple factors: the nature of the transgression, the status of those involved, previous behaviour, circumstances that led to the problem, and the judgment of those with authority. Medieval justice in castles was rarely rigid or automatic, but rather adapted to circumstances while maintaining core principles of order and hierarchy. Maintaining order within castle walls was not an occasional dramatic event, but rather a constant, quiet practice woven into daily life. Most days saw minor corrections, small adjustments, and the ongoing work of keeping hundreds of people functioning harmoniously in close quarters. Understanding this everyday reality provides insight into how medieval communities actually operated. Morning routines began with clear expectations. Servants rose before dawn to their assigned duties, guards changed shifts according to strict schedules, and craftspeople began work at appointed hours. Lateness or absence didn't go unnoticed. The steward or other officials kept careful track of who appeared when, and patterns of unreliability led to conversations, warnings, and eventually consequences if improvements didn't follow. The Great Hall, where much of castle life centred, operated under clear rules of conduct. Seating arrangements reflected social hierarchy, with positions at tables indicating status and role. Speaking out of turn, showing disrespect to those of higher rank, or disrupting meals could lead to immediate correction. Someone might be asked to leave the hall, assigned to eat elsewhere, or face loss of their usual place for a period. These adjustments, while not dramatic, carried real meaning in a world defined by position and privilege. Kitchen operations, with their combination of heat, sharp implements, and valuable provisions, required particular discipline. The master cook maintained authority over a staff that might number a dozen or more people, all working in close coordination to prepare meals for the entire castle. Theft of food, even in small amounts, was taken seriously, not only because provisions were carefully managed, but because trust was essential in such an environment. A cook caught taking extra portions might find their responsibilities reduced, or their position eliminated entirely. The castle's defensive functions demanded unwavering reliability. Guards who fell asleep on watch, failed to properly check those entering gates, or neglected their equipment, faced swift response from the constable. In a world where castle security could mean the difference between life and death during conflicts, such lapses weren't treated as minor matters. Guards understood that their role carried both privilege and responsibility, and failing the latter meant losing the former. Stables required constant attention, and the marshal oversaw this work with particular care. Horses represented an enormous investment, and were essential to the lord's military and social standing. A groom who neglected a valuable horse, failed to properly maintain equipment, or showed carelessness in this domain could expect serious consequences. The marshal's authority in this area was absolute, and everyone connected to stable work understood that their positions depended on consistent, careful attention to duties. Craftspeople working within castle walls, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and others operated under agreements that specified their responsibilities and privileges. Producing inferior work, failing to complete projects on schedule, or wasting materials violated these agreements. The consequences might include reduced payment, loss of the privilege to work within the castle, or requirements to redo work without additional compensation. Quality and reliability were expected, not optional. Disputes between individuals required careful handling to prevent escalation. When servants quarrelled, when workers disagreed about responsibilities, or when personal conflicts arose, castle authorities stepped in quickly. The goal was resolution rather than victory, finding ways for people to continue working together, rather than allowing feuds to disrupt castle operations. Mediators listened to both sides, identified the heart of the problem, and proposed solutions that allowed everyone to maintain dignity while moving forward. Children within the castle, whether offspring of nobles or servants, lived under the watchful eyes of many adults. Misbehaviour rarely went unnoticed or unaddressed. A child who caused problems might be redirected by any adult who witnessed it, not just their parents. This communal approach to child rearing meant that expectations were consistently reinforced and corrections applied promptly. Young people learned early that the entire community had a stake in their proper development. Cleanliness and order in living quarters, while basic, were enforced expectations. Personal spaces were inspected periodically, and those who maintained neat, organised areas received approval, while those whose spaces fell into disorder faced requirements to improve. This wasn't merely aesthetic preference, but reflected understanding that order in personal spaces contributed to order in communal life. The chaplain's role extended beyond religious services to include moral guidance and addressing matters of conscience. Someone struggling with temptation, dealing with resentment, or facing ethical dilemmas could seek counsel from the chaplain. This preventative function helped address problems before they manifested in actual transgressions, offering guidance and support that maintained community harmony. Seasonal variations affected castle discipline. During harvest seasons, when everyone worked long hours to bring in crops, certain standards relaxed slightly. People were forgiven for fatigue-related lapses that would normally receive correction. During winter months, when cold and darkness tested everyone's patience, authorities understood that tensions ran higher and made allowances. This flexibility recognised that consistent discipline required understanding of circumstances. Special occasions, feast days, celebrations, and holy days brought their own expectations. These times called for particular behaviour appropriate to the event. Someone who caused disruption during an important feast, showed disrespect during religious observances, or failed to participate appropriately in communal celebrations faced disapproval that extended beyond simple correction. These events mattered to the entire community, and proper conduct was expected from all. The rhythm of castle life created natural accountability. Everyone knew their responsibilities, understood expectations, and recognised that their actions were observed by the community. This wasn't oppressive surveillance, but rather the natural result of communal living. People looked out for one another, noticed when someone struggled, and intervened before small problems became large ones. Record keeping, while not as detailed as modern documentation, tracked significant matters. The steward maintained accounts that noted serious infractions, consequences applied, and patterns of behaviour. These records informed decisions about promotions, assignments, and trust. A history of reliability opened doors, while a pattern of problems closed them. People understood that their behaviour created a reputation that followed them. Elderly members of castle communities, those who had served loyally for years, often received special consideration. Age brought challenges, declining physical capabilities, and sometimes diminished capacity for demanding work. Rather than applying rigid standards, castle authorities adjusted expectations while maintaining dignity. An ageing servant might be given less demanding duties while retaining their position and privileges, recognising their years of service. Physical capability varied among castle inhabitants, and expectations adjusted accordingly. Someone with particular limitations might be assigned work suited to their abilities rather than expected to perform tasks beyond their capacity. This practical approach ensured that everyone contributed, while recognising that not all people could do all work. The emphasis was on useful contribution, not uniform capability. Social bonds within castle communities created informal networks of support and accountability. Friends looked after one another, warned each other away from potential problems, and helped maintain proper behaviour. These relationships, built over years of living and working together, served as the castle's first line of defence against disorder. Most problems were addressed through these informal channels long before official intervention became necessary. The lady of the castle played a particularly important role in managing household discipline among female servants and in matters related to domestic operations. Her authority, while different from her husband's, was real and respected. Women in the castle knew that their conduct, work quality and reliability were observed by the lady, whose approval or disapproval shaped their experiences and opportunities. Training new members of castle communities emphasised not just skills, but proper behaviour and understanding of expectations. Young people entering service learned from experienced workers who modelled appropriate conduct and explained the unwritten rules that governed castle life. This mentorship system ensured that standards were passed down and maintained across generations of castle inhabitants. The everyday reality of castle discipline was ultimately about maintaining a functioning community. With so many people living in close proximity, sharing resources and depending on one another, clear expectations and consistent responses to problems weren't luxuries but necessities. The systems that developed over centuries reflected accumulated wisdom about human nature, group dynamics, and the challenges of communal life. Medieval castles contained a variety of specialised chambers, each designed for specific functions within the complex machinery of feudal life. Understanding these spaces provides insight into how castles operated as self-contained communities and how different activities were accommodated within their stone walls. The undercroft, typically located beneath the Great Hall or main living quarters, served multiple essential functions. These vaulted spaces, cool and dark even in summer, provided ideal storage for wine, ale, and preserved foods. Thick stone walls maintained stable temperatures, protecting valuable provisions from spoilage. The same qualities that made undercrofts excellent for storage also suited them for other purposes requiring isolation and controlled environment. Many castles featured chambers built directly into the thickness of their curtain walls. These spaces, accessed through small doorways and sometimes connected by narrow passages, existed almost hidden within the castle's defensive structure. Some served as private storage for the lord's most valuable possessions. Others provided quiet spaces for private conversations or contemplation. Their very concealment made them suitable for activities requiring discretion. The porter's lodge, located near the main gate, served as a control point for everyone entering or leaving the castle. This space typically included a small chamber, where the porter could rest between duties and a larger area where incoming visitors waited while their business was assessed. The porter held significant authority, deciding who gained entry and who was turned away, making this humble space a crucial point of contact between the castle and the outside world. Solar chambers, private rooms for the lord's family, represented the most privileged spaces in the castle. These rooms, usually located in the keep's upper floors where they could catch sunlight and benefit from better ventilation, provided refuge from the crowded public areas below. Access to these spaces was carefully controlled, with only trusted servants and family members permitted entry. The privacy these chambers offered was a luxury few castle inhabitants enjoyed. Guardrobe towers, containing the castle's sanitation facilities, were marvels of medieval engineering. These vertical shafts, built into external walls, allowed waste to drop into moats, rivers, or collection pits far below. The chambers themselves were small, enclosed spaces with stone seats and openings, providing necessary facilities while maintaining the main living areas in more pleasant condition. Multiple guardrobes throughout a large castle ensured access for different groups of inhabitants. Wells and water systems represented critical infrastructure. Many castles featured wells sunk deep into bedrock, sometimes reaching hundreds of feet down to ensure water supply during sieges. The well chamber, typically located in a secure area of the castle, was closely guarded, as poisoning the water supply was a constant fear. Cisterns, collecting rainwater from roofs and courtyard surfaces, supplemented wells, with stone chambers storing this precious resource. Chapel spaces served the spiritual needs of castle communities. These sacred rooms, ranging from simple chambers to elaborate churches, provided venues for daily prayers, special masses, and religious ceremonies. The castle chaplain maintained these spaces, and attendance at services was expected of all residents. The chapel represented a world apart from the secular activities surrounding it, a space of contemplation and devotion. Smithies and workshops, often located in outer baileys or against curtained walls, housed the constant work of maintaining castle operations. Blacksmiths forged and repaired metal items, carpenters constructed and fixed wooden structures, and other craftspeople plied their trades. These spaces, filled with tools, materials, and the sounds of productive labour, hummed with activity during daylight hours. The master craftsmen who oversaw these spaces held significant authority over their domains. Guard rooms, positioned at strategic points throughout the castle, provided spaces for soldiers to rest between duties, store equipment, and maintain readiness. These chambers, typically austere and functional, contained benches, storage for weapons and armour, and sometimes simple cooking facilities. The constable regularly inspected guard rooms, ensuring that equipment remained in good condition and that guards maintained proper standards. Pantries and butteries, specialised storage areas located near the Great Hall, held the castle's food supplies. The pantry stored bread, the buttery held beverages, and both were carefully managed by appointed officials who controlled access and maintained inventories. These spaces were kept clean, dry, and organised, with everything from common provisions to rare delicacies stored according to strict systems that prevented waste and theft. Secret chambers and passages appeared in some castles, though perhaps not as commonly as popular imagination suggests. These hidden spaces, concealed behind false walls or accessible through disguised doors, served various purposes. Some provided emergency escape routes, others stored the lord's most valuable treasures. A few allowed for discreet movement between different parts of the castle. Their existence was known to few, adding an element of mystery to castle architecture. Chambers for honoured guests appeared in most substantial castles. These rooms, while smaller and less elaborate than the family's private chambers, offered a level of comfort and privacy appropriate to the rank of visiting nobles or important merchants. Located in secure areas but with appropriate access to public spaces, these guest chambers reflected the castle's hospitality while maintaining proper security. Ground-level chambers in gate towers served important functions related to castle access. These spaces, adjacent to the main gates, allowed close supervision of everyone entering or leaving. They might house additional guards, contain mechanisms for operating gate defences, or provide temporary holding areas for visitors whose business required verification before they proceeded deeper into the castle. The castle's architectural diversity reflected the complexity of medieval life. Each space, purpose-built or adapted over time, contributed to the functioning whole. Understanding these varied chambers and their uses helps illuminate how castles served as complete communities, self-sufficient worlds capable of supporting hundreds of people through all seasons and circumstances. Medieval castle communities recognized the importance of visible consequences in maintaining social order. The concept wasn't unique to castles, but found expression throughout medieval society, from villages to cities to the great fortresses that dominated the landscape. Public awareness served multiple purposes, all essential to the functioning of close-knit communities. When someone's behaviour required correction, the response often incorporated an element of community acknowledgement. This wasn't gratuitous display, but rather reflected medieval understanding that justice served the entire community, not just those directly involved. By making consequences visible, authorities reinforced expectations for everyone, reminded all of the standards that governed their society, and demonstrated that order was maintained consistently. The castle courtyard, the heart of daily activity, served as a natural gathering place where much of castle life unfolded. This open space, surrounded by buildings and overlooked by windows, provided a stage where community matters could be addressed with appropriate visibility. During busy times of day, when people crossed the courtyard attending to various duties, those watching could observe how the castle's authorities maintained order and addressed problems. Public apologies, delivered before witnesses, served as formal closures to many situations. These weren't casual expressions of regret, but carefully structured statements following prescribed formats. The person would identify themselves, state what they had done, acknowledge their error, express appropriate regret, and pledge proper future conduct. Witnesses heard and acknowledged these statements, making the apology a community event rather than a private matter. The role of witnesses in medieval justice cannot be overstated. People were called upon to witness proceedings, verify statements, and attest to what they had observed. This participation made justice a communal responsibility, with many people sharing in the process rather than leaving it entirely to authorities. Someone called as a witness understood that their honesty and accuracy mattered to the community's proper functioning. Public proceedings also served educational purposes. Young people, watching how matters were addressed, learned what was expected of them and what happened when expectations weren't met. The lessons weren't abstract but concrete, demonstrated through real situations affecting people they knew. This experiential education shaped behaviour more effectively than any amount of verbal instruction could. The balance between visibility and dignity required careful management. Medieval authorities understood that consequences needed to be seen, but also that people needed paths back to good standing. Excessive humiliation might break someone's spirit rather than correcting behaviour, while insufficient visibility might fail to reinforce community standards. Finding the right balance required wisdom and judgment from those in authority. Gradual restoration to full community standing marked the completion of corrective processes. As someone demonstrated improved behaviour over time, small changes would acknowledge their progress. They might be assigned back to better work positions, returned to their usual place at meals, or included once again in communal activities from which they had been excluded. These gradual changes allowed everyone to see that the path forward existed and that sustained proper behaviour led to restoration. The role of gossip and informal communication meant that even private matters often achieved a degree of visibility through community discussion. People talked, shared information, and discussed what was happening within their community. While authorities might not officially publicise certain matters, everyone still learned about them through these informal networks. Medieval castle communities had few secrets, and this natural transparency served its own regulatory function. Public awareness of consequences, whether through formal proceedings or informal knowledge, created a social environment where expectations were constantly reinforced. People didn't need to experience consequences personally to understand what behaviour was acceptable and what was not. They saw and heard about what happened to others, and these observations shaped their own conduct. The community itself became an instrument of social regulation. Medieval society's rigid hierarchy profoundly influenced how transgressions were addressed within castle walls. A person's social position determined not only their daily experiences and opportunities, but also how the justice system treated them when problems arose. Understanding this relationship between status and consequences illuminates medieval values and priorities. Knights and nobles, those who held feudal obligations and warrior status, existed in a protected category. Their transgressions, when they occurred, were handled with careful attention to honour and reputation. A knight who failed in his duties or committed an infraction wouldn't be subjected to the same responses as a servant or craftsperson. Instead, consequences focused on matters appropriate to knightly status. Loss of favour, removal from certain positions of trust or requirements to make substantial restitution. The concept of honour dominated noble life. A nobleman's reputation, carefully built and maintained, represented his most valuable possession beyond physical property. Consequences that damaged honour were therefore more serious than those affecting only comfort or convenience. Being publicly shamed before one's peers carried enormous weight, potentially more than any physical discomfort. Noble families went to great lengths to protect their members' reputations and to minimise damage when problems occurred. Military obligations complicated matters when knights transgressed. These men weren't simply residents, but warriors upon whom the Lord depended for defence and military service. Consequences needed to address the problem without undermining military effectiveness. A knight might face internal discipline, handled privately within the warrior class, rather than public proceedings that could damage morale or weaken the fighting force. Ladies of noble birth occupied complex positions in the justice system. Their status protected them from many consequences that commoners might face, but they also lived under intense scrutiny regarding proper behaviour. A noble woman who stepped outside accepted bounds might face consequences administered by her family, by the lady of the castle, or in extreme cases by ecclesiastical authorities. The emphasis was on maintaining dignity while addressing the situation discreetly. Clerics, those in religious orders or serving as castle chaplains, answered to church authority rather than secular justice in many matters. This created occasional complications when clerics transgressed, as castle authorities had limited jurisdiction. The Lord might request that the bishop address the situation, but he couldn't simply impose consequences on clergy, as he could on other castle residents. Church law and secular law existed in parallel, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting. Upper servants, those who held positions of authority over others, faced heightened expectations. A steward, marshal, or constable who failed in duties or transgressed carried additional burden because their positions required exemplary conduct. Consequences for these officials often included loss of position, a severe outcome in a world where such appointments represented significant achievement and provided substantial benefits. Skilled craftspeople held intermediate positions in the social hierarchy. They weren't nobles, but their specialised knowledge and abilities gave them status above common labourers. A master blacksmith or carpenter who created problems might face consequences that acknowledged their skill while addressing the transgression. They might lose certain privileges without losing their position entirely, or face requirements to provide additional work without payment. Common servants, those who performed basic labour throughout the castle, had the least protection and faced the most straightforward consequences. Their positions were more easily replaced, their loss caused less disruption, and they had no special status requiring careful handling. This isn't to say they were treated cruelly, but rather that responses to their transgressions followed more direct paths. Extra duties, loss of privileges, or in serious cases dismissal from service represented typical outcomes. Apprentices and young people learning trades occupied a special category. Their transgressions were often viewed as part of learning, mistakes made while developing skills and understanding. Consequences emphasised instruction over pure discipline, helping them learn proper behaviour while developing their craft abilities. Master craftsmen took responsibility for their apprentices' conduct, adding another layer to the relationship. Gender significantly influenced how justice was administered. Women faced different expectations than men, and consequences reflected these gendered norms. Women's behaviour was judged against standards of modesty, obedience, and proper domestic conduct. Transgressions that challenged these expectations were viewed more seriously than similar behaviour might be in men. Conversely, certain forms of misbehaviour more associated with men drew less attention when women were involved. Children of the nobility were carefully protected from the full weight of castle justice. A lord's child who misbehaved would be disciplined by family, tutors, or carefully selected representatives, not subjected to public processes. This protection extended through adolescence and into young adulthood, though expectations increased with age. Noble children learned that status brought protection, but also obligation, and as they matured they were expected to demonstrate conduct worthy of their position. Elderly individuals, particularly those who had served the castle loyally for many years, received considerable leniency. Authorities recognised that age brought challenges, and that someone who had served well deserved respect in their declining years. An elderly servant who struggled to maintain previous standards might be given adjusted duties rather than facing consequences, acknowledging their lifetime of service. People with physical limitations or ailments found that their circumstances influenced how situations were handled. Medieval society, while not employing modern concepts of accommodation, recognised that different people had different capabilities. Someone whose transgression resulted from their limitations rather than willful misbehaviour might be treated with understanding, their duties adjusted rather than consequences imposed. Visitors and temporary residents occupied uncertain positions. A merchant visiting for a few days, a travelling craftsperson offering specialised services, or a messenger from another lord fell outside the normal social structure. If they caused problems, responses needed to consider that they weren't permanent community members. Consequences might emphasise restitution and departure rather than the longer-term approaches used with residents. Family connection significantly influenced outcomes. Someone related to important castle officials, connected by marriage to influential families, or with kin in positions of authority, received different treatment than isolated individuals. This wasn't necessarily corruption but reflected reality, that maintaining harmony required considering the broader implications of decisions. Consequences that might create feuds or damage important relationships were approached cautiously. The concept of lineage, family history and reputation coloured everything. Someone from a family known for loyalty and service received benefit of doubt that others didn't. Conversely, someone from a family with a history of problems faced heightened scrutiny. Medieval society thought in terms of families and generations, not just individuals, and justice reflected these long-term considerations. Economic value also mattered, though rarely stated so baldly. Someone whose skills were difficult to replace, whose work was particularly valuable, or whose loss would significantly harm castle operations received different treatment than someone easily replaced. Practical considerations influenced decisions, balancing the need to maintain order against the cost of removing valuable contributors. The status dynamics created a complex web where similar actions by different people led to different outcomes. Medieval society didn't see this as unfairness, but as appropriate recognition of different roles and responsibilities. A knight held different obligations than a servant, a noblewoman different expectations than a common girl. Justice that treated everyone identically would have been seen as ignoring these essential distinctions. Understanding these status-based differences helps modern observers comprehend medieval values. The period's concept of justice emphasised maintaining proper social order, ensuring that everyone fulfilled their appropriate role, and preserving the stability upon which all depended. Individual circumstances mattered, but they mattered within the framework of social hierarchy that structured everything in medieval life. Medieval castles, designed primarily for defence and lordly residence, also contained spaces that served when temporary isolation of individuals became necessary. These areas, while not resembling modern facilities, fulfilled essential functions in maintaining castle order. Understanding their design and purposes provides insight into medieval approaches to confinement and control. Tower chambers, particularly in the lower levels, offered naturally secure spaces. Thick stone walls, sometimes extending 6 feet or more in depth, provided security no wooden structure could match. Small windows, if they existed at all, were mere slits too narrow for escape. Single doorways, the only access points, could be secured with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands. These architectural features made certain tower rooms inherently suited to temporary confinement. The design of these spaces varied considerably. Some were surprisingly spacious, round or square chambers spanning the full width of the tower's interior. Others were cramped, barely larger than a modern closet carved from the tower's thick walls. Size and comfort level varied based on the status of the person confined and the nature of their situation. A nobleman awaiting ransom enjoyed very different conditions than a common criminal. Lighting in these chambers came primarily from narrow arrow slits or small openings cut through the thick walls. During daylight hours, thin shafts of light penetrated the gloom, though rarely enough to fully illuminate the space. At night, total darkness prevailed unless someone provided candles or rushlights. This natural dimness was a consequence of defensive design rather than intentional deprivation, though it certainly contributed to the isolation these spaces created. Ventilation varied widely. Some chambers benefited from multiple small openings that allowed air circulation. Others, particularly those deep within towers or below ground level, relied on minimal airflow from the doorway or small vents cut through the stone. The air in such spaces might be stale and damp, particularly in winter months when cold moisture seemed to seep through the very stones. Furnishing in confinement chambers ranged from minimal to non-existent. Stone benches built into walls provided seating, and sometimes a simple wooden platform served as a bed. Straw might be provided for bedding, changed at intervals depending on the person's status and the attention of those responsible for them. A bucket or stone channel addressed sanitation needs, with arrangements varying widely based on the chamber's design. Temperature control was essentially non-existent. Tower chambers, surrounded by thick stone, maintained relatively stable temperatures, but this meant cold in winter and mild but clammy in summer. Someone confined in such a space during winter months experienced considerable discomfort, though the constant temperature prevented the extreme fluctuations that made ground-level chambers more challenging during seasonal extremes. Basement chambers, located below the castle's main levels, offered additional isolation. Reached by descending narrow stone staircases and passing through heavy doors, these spaces existed in an underworld separate from the castle's daily life. The journey to these chambers itself reinforced separation, each step down carrying the person further from the community above and deeper into solitude. Security in these spaces came naturally from architecture. Thick walls prevented any possibility of breaking through. Heavy doors, secured with iron bars and multiple locks, eliminated hope of forced exit. The height of tower chambers, sometimes dozens of feet above ground level, made any escape through windows impossible even if they weren't too narrow. The castle's very bones provided confinement. Sound travelled strangely in these stone chambers. Voices might echo oddly, distorted by the stone surfaces. Sounds from other parts of the castle arrived muted and distant, if at all. The thickness of walls that provided security also created acoustic isolation, separating the confined person from the daily rhythm of castle life. This separation, while not intentional, contributed to the psychological impact of confinement. Guards stationed near these areas provided human oversight to supplement architectural security. A soldier might sit outside the chamber door, ensuring no unauthorized access occurred, and that the confined person received food and water. These guards worked in shifts, ensuring constant presence without any single person bearing the entire burden. Their role was oversight, not interaction, and communication between guard and confined remained minimal. Some castles featured chains and iron rings set into walls or floors. These fixtures, permanently embedded in the stonework, allowed additional security measures when necessary. Iron manacles, secured to these rings by chains, prevented movement beyond a limited area. The weight and strength of these implements forged by castle blacksmiths made them essentially inescapable without tools and time that confined persons didn't have. The psychological impact of these chambers merits consideration. Stone walls that initially seemed solid protection became oppressive enclosure. The same narrow windows that defended against attack prevented view of anything beyond immediate vicinity. Time moved differently in unchanging dimness, with no activities to mark hours beyond the arrival of meals. The isolation, while temporary for most, felt longer in the experiencing than in the measuring. Duration of confinement varied enormously based on circumstances. Someone might spend a few hours in such a space, time enough to cool tempers and reflect. Others remained for days or weeks, particularly if confined while awaiting trial, judgment, or the arrival of someone with authority to make decisions about their case. In rare instances involving serious matters or political complications, confinement might extend to months. Food and water provision followed basic patterns. Meals, simpler than what the person might normally receive, arrived at regular intervals. Guards passed food through the doorway, ensuring the confined person received sustenance while maintaining security. Water, drawn from castle wells or cisterns, provided hydration. The quality and quantity of provisions again varied with the person's status and the specific circumstances. Communication with the outside world depended entirely on those holding authority. A confined person had no inherent right to messages or visits, though such contact might be granted depending on circumstances. A noble awaiting ransom negotiations might receive regular contact with the outside world. A common person confined for routine discipline might have no communication beyond what guards provided. Sanitation in these spaces posed ongoing challenges. Stone chambers, for all their other qualities, weren't designed with comfort as a priority. Some had small drains cut into floors, others relied on buckets that were emptied periodically. The less pleasant aspects of confinement weren't intended as additional discipline, but rather represented the practical realities of these spaces' design and original purposes. Dampness affected many lower-level chambers. Stone walls, in contact with earth, wicked moisture from the ground. Even castles built with sophisticated drainage systems couldn't eliminate this entirely. The result was chambers that felt perpetually clammy, with condensation forming on walls and a musty smell pervading the air. Straw used for bedding absorbed this moisture, requiring frequent replacement. The dual nature of these spaces deserves recognition. They served practical purposes, providing secure areas when temporary confinement became necessary. But they also represented the castle's authority, physical manifestations of the Lord's power to separate individuals from the community. The architecture itself demonstrated that transgressing accepted bounds led to removal from the social body until matters could be resolved. Modern visitors to medieval castles often pass these chambers with little awareness of their original purposes. A small doorway in a tower wall, stone steps descending into darkness, or a cramped chamber open to tourist view once served as instruments of medieval justice. Understanding their function helps illuminate how castle communities maintained order and addressed problems within their close-knit populations. Medieval castle justice didn't focus solely on consequences, but also on the path back to good standing within the community. The process of restoration, carefully structured and socially meaningful, provided mechanisms for individuals to demonstrate improved behaviour and gradually rejoin the community in their former position. This emphasis on restoration reflected medieval understanding that sustainable order required paths forward, not just responses to transgressions. The completion of immediate consequences marked the beginning, not the end, of restoration. Someone who had spent time in temporary confinement, completed extra duties, or endured public acknowledgement of their transgression reached a transition point. They had satisfied the direct response to their behaviour, but full restoration required additional steps. This staged process prevented immediate return to previous status while providing clear benchmarks for progress. Demonstration of changed behaviour formed the foundation of restoration. Medieval authorities understood that true improvement showed itself through sustained proper conduct, not merely completing assigned consequences. Someone seeking restoration needed to demonstrate day after day that they had internalized lessons and committed to different behaviour. This observation period varied in length, but typically extended weeks or months. Work assignments during restoration often differed from a person's normal duties. Someone might be given tasks that, while not punitive, weren't their preferred or usual work. This served multiple purposes. It broke old patterns associated with previous problems, demonstrated willingness to contribute in whatever capacity requested, and allowed authorities to observe behaviour in different contexts. Humble, reliable completion of these assignments spoke louder than any verbal promises. Mentorship relationships sometimes developed during restoration. An elder servant, respected craftsperson, or minor official might be assigned to guide someone through the restoration process. This mentor would offer advice, observe behaviour, and gradually expand the person's responsibilities as improvement continued. The relationship provided support while ensuring accountability, helping the person navigate the path back to full community membership. Gradual restoration of privileges marked visible progress. Someone might first regain attendance at communal meals, though seated in a position indicating their current status. Later, they might be returned to their normal seat, signalling further advancement. Subsequently, they could be permitted to attend certain gatherings or activities from which they had been excluded. Each small restoration reinforced that progress was occurring, and that full reintegration approached. Formal acknowledgement by authorities provided important milestones. The steward, constable, or other appropriate official might publicly state that someone had completed their consequences and was progressing satisfactorily. These statements, made before witnesses, carried official weight and informed the community that the person's status was improving. They also created accountability, as everyone now knew that the person was in restoration and expected to continue demonstrating proper behaviour. Community acceptance represented an essential element that couldn't be mandated but had to be earned. Fellow servants, co-workers, and community members formed opinions based on observed behaviour. Someone genuinely changed would gradually win back trust and acceptance through consistency, reliability, and evident commitment to proper conduct. This social restoration, parallel to official restoration, ultimately mattered more in daily life than any formal pronouncement. Religious elements often featured in restoration processes. Someone might be required to attend additional chapel services, undertake specific prayers or fasts, or receive spiritual counsel from the castle chaplain. These religious components reflected medieval worldview, that proper behaviour had spiritual dimensions, and that restoration included not just external conduct, but internal transformation. Completion of restoration was itself a formal event. The lord or his representative might make a public declaration that the person was fully restored to good standing, with all previous matters considered closed. This announcement, witnessed by the community, officially ended the restoration period and returned the person to their former status. It was a moment of closure for everyone involved, allowing the community to move forward without lingering questions about the person's standing. Documentation of restoration, while not elaborate by modern standards, occurred in stewards' records. A note that someone had successfully completed consequences and restoration created an official record of their return to good standing. This documentation mattered if questions arose later, providing evidence that the matter had been fully resolved and shouldn't be held against the person indefinitely. Forgiveness, both formal and informal, played crucial roles in allowing restoration to succeed. Medieval Christianity emphasised forgiveness, and castle communities, however imperfectly, tried to embody this value. Once someone completed restoration, continued judgment or grudge-holding was discouraged. The expectation was that everyone would treat the restored person as they had before the transgression, giving them a genuine fresh start. Some restrictions might remain even after formal restoration. Someone who had committed a particularly serious transgression might find certain positions or responsibilities permanently closed to them. They could be restored to good standing and full participation in community life, while still not being considered for positions requiring absolute trust. This wasn't ongoing consequence, but rather practical recognition that some actions had lasting implications. The length of the restoration process varied based on multiple factors: the severity of the original transgression, the person's status and responsibilities, their demonstrated commitment to change, and the judgment of those overseeing the process. Some restorations completed in weeks, others took months, and a few extended even longer. The goal was genuine restoration, not merely passage of time, so completion depended on authentic progress rather than arbitrary schedules. Failed restorations occasionally occurred. If someone in the restoration process committed new transgressions or failed to demonstrate genuine change, they might face renewed consequences more severe than the originals. Repeated patterns of transgression and failed restoration could lead to permanent exclusion from the community, as authorities concluded that the person either couldn't or wouldn't maintain proper behaviour. Successful restoration benefited everyone. The individual regained their place in the community, authorities demonstrated that improvement was possible and rewarded, and the community received back a member who had learned from mistakes. This emphasis on restoration rather than permanent exclusion reflected practical wisdom. Castle communities needed every capable person, and casting someone out permanently served no one's interests if restoration was possible. The path of restoration also served educational purposes for the broader community. Others watched as someone worked through the restoration process, learning that transgressions had consequences, but that paths forward existed. This balanced message, that order would be maintained but restoration was possible, created a social environment encouraging proper behaviour while offering hope to those who stumbled. Family members and friends played important, if informal, roles in restoration. They might encourage improved behaviour, provide emotional support during difficult periods, or model proper conduct. These personal relationships, while not part of official restoration processes, often made the difference between successful and failed restoration. Medieval communities recognised that people were embedded in networks of relationships, and that these connections influenced behaviour and outcomes. The completion of consequences and restoration didn't erase the past, but transformed how it influenced the present and future. Medieval castle inhabitants who had been through the justice system experienced consequences and completed restoration, found themselves navigating a social landscape shaped by memory, but also by community values, emphasising forgiveness and practical needs. Immediate aftermath brought a settling period. Someone newly restored to good standing re-entered community life, resuming their duties and relationships. The initial days and weeks required adjustment as they and those around them established new patterns. Everyone understood that the person had been through consequences, but the expectation was to move forward rather than dwell on what had passed. Work assignments typically returned to previous patterns, though sometimes with adjustments. If someone had discovered new capabilities or interests during their restoration period, these might be incorporated into their duties. Conversely, if it became clear that their previous assignment had contributed to problems, a thoughtful change might benefit everyone. The goal was productive integration, not rigid return to exactly what had existed before. Social relationships reformed gradually. Trust, once broken, required time and consistency to rebuild. Close friendships that had been strained might strengthen again, while relationships that had contributed to problems might be naturally avoided. The person who had been through consequences often approached relationships more thoughtfully, recognizing which connections supported proper behavior and which led to difficulties. Reputation, that crucial element of medieval life, evolved based on sustained behavior. Someone who maintained proper conduct after restoration gradually rebuilt a positive reputation. The memory of consequences faded in importance compared to observed patterns of reliability, capability, and trustworthiness. Medieval communities, practical by necessity, judged people by what they demonstrated over time rather than permanently defining them by past mistakes. Opportunities for advancement remained possible, though perhaps requiring more time and demonstrated reliability than they would have otherwise. A servant who had stumbled but then showed sustained improvement might eventually rise to positions of greater responsibility. The path might take longer, the scrutiny might be more intense. But medieval castle communities needed capable people and couldn't afford to permanently exclude everyone who had required correction. Lessons learned through consequences and restoration often shaped people profoundly. Someone who had experienced isolation, loss of status, or other consequences gained understanding that abstract warnings never provided. This experiential knowledge frequently translated into genuine behaviour change, as the person understood viscerally what resulted from poor choices. Many became valued community members precisely because they had learned difficult lessons thoroughly. Young people who experienced consequences early in their castle service sometimes later became excellent workers and eventually supervisors. The early correction, painful at the time, shaped their development and taught them to navigate castle life successfully. Rather than being permanently disadvantaged by youthful mistakes, they matured into reliable adults whose past struggles gave them wisdom and understanding. Family members of those who had experienced consequences often shared in both the difficulties and the growth. A parent whose child required correction learned to provide better guidance. Siblings understood more clearly what behaviour the community expected. Spouses learned to better support proper conduct in their partners. The ripple effects of consequences and restoration extended beyond the individual directly involved. Some who had been through the justice system developed empathy for others who stumbled. Having experienced consequences personally, they understood the difficulty and shame involved. These individuals sometimes became informal counsellors, offering advice to others struggling with similar issues, or advocates who helped ensure that consequences were applied fairly and restoration was genuinely possible. The scarring, both physical and psychological, that resulted from medieval punishments is often emphasised in popular accounts. However, for most people who experience castle justice, the lasting impacts were more subtle. They had experienced an unpleasant period, learned important lessons, and moved forward. Life in close-knit communities required resilience, and most medieval people possessed it in abundance. Integration back into communal activities marked important steps in life after consequences. Attending feasts and celebrations, participating in religious observances, joining in festivals and holy days all helped restore the person's sense of belonging. These communal moments, shared with others who had witnessed both transgression and restoration, affirmed that the person was once again fully part of the community. Spiritual recovery sometimes paralleled social restoration. Someone who had transgressed might spend time in prayer, and religious observances beyond what was required, seeking both divine forgiveness and internal peace. The castle chaplain, having often played a role in the restoration process, continued to offer spiritual guidance as the person reintegrated into normal life. Economic stability gradually returned as normal work patterns resumed. Someone who had lost wages during consequences or paid fines began rebuilding their resources. Medieval castle staff, while never wealthy, needed modest savings to manage unexpected problems. Returning to financial stability contributed to overall recovery and reduced stress that might otherwise lead to further problems. Children of those who had experienced consequences sometimes faced social challenges. Medieval communities, while forgiving of individuals who demonstrated change, had long memories. Young people growing up might hear references to their parents' past difficulties, requiring them to prove themselves through their own behaviour, rather than benefiting from unblemished family reputation. This added pressure shaped their development. Elderly individuals who had experienced consequences earlier in life often reflected on how those experiences shaped them. In reminiscing, they might acknowledge that the difficult period, while unpleasant, ultimately helped them become better people. This mature perspective, gained through years of reflection, helped younger community members understand that mistakes needn't define a lifetime. The accumulation of life experiences gradually overshadowed any single period of difficulty. Someone who lived decades in castle service, contributing reliably and capably, eventually became known primarily for that sustained positive record rather than for difficulties decades in the past. Time itself, combined with consistent good conduct, provided the final restoration that formal processes began. Gratitude sometimes developed in those who'd been through consequences and emerged successfully. They recognised that the system, while imperfect, had provided both correction and opportunity for restoration rather than permanent exclusion. This gratitude translated into loyalty and commitment to the community that had given them second chances. The cyclical nature of castle life meant that someone who had experienced consequences might later participate in addressing others' transgressions. A servant who had learned difficult lessons might become a supervisor who needed to correct those under their authority. Their own experiences informed how they approached these situations, often making them more effective and compassionate, while still maintaining necessary standards. Life after consequences, then, was neither completely fresh start nor permanent shadow. It represented continuing existence in a community that held memory, but also valued growth, acknowledged past but focused on present, and maintained standards while recognising human imperfection. Medieval castle inhabitants navigated this nuanced social landscape with practical wisdom born of necessity and sustained community. The systems of justice developed within European castle walls over centuries of medieval life left marks extending far beyond those stone fortifications. Understanding this legacy requires looking not just at the specific practices, but at the broader patterns of thinking about community, order, and human behaviour that shaped medieval approaches. Castle justice reflected fundamental assumptions about human society. Medieval thinkers, influenced by both classical philosophy and Christian theology, believed that social hierarchy was natural and divinely ordained. Different people held different positions, each with appropriate responsibilities and privileges. Justice systems reflected these assumptions, treating people according to their status while also holding everyone to standards appropriate to their role. The concept of community responsibility, so central to castle justice, influenced later developments. The idea that maintaining order required collective participation rather than being solely the authority's burden shaped thinking about governance. Modern concepts of civic responsibility and community engagement trace distant roots to medieval practices where everyone shared in maintaining social order. Transparency and justice, the medieval emphasis on visible consequences and public proceedings, left complex legacies. While modern systems value privacy in many cases, the underlying principle that justice serves the entire community rather than just those directly involved remains influential. Public trials, community service, and other practices reflect continued belief that justice has communal dimensions. The integration of religious and secular authority in medieval justice eventually led to their separation in most modern systems. The tensions between church and temporal power, evident even in medieval castle justice, contributed to eventual development of distinct spheres. Understanding this historical intertwining helps explain why separation of church and state became such a valued principle in many later societies. Medieval emphasis on restoration rather than permanent exclusion influenced rehabilitation concepts in modern justice systems. The idea that people can change, that pathways back to good standing should exist, and that society benefits from successful reintegration rather than permanent marginalisation all echo medieval practices. While implementations differ dramatically, underlying principles show remarkable continuity. The role of social pressure in maintaining order, so central to medieval communities, continues in modified forms. Small communities still rely partially on social accountability, reputation, and informal networks to encourage proper behaviour. Understanding medieval approaches helps illuminate why these mechanisms remain effective, even in societies with elaborate formal justice systems. Castle justice's accommodation of different circumstances, status, relationships, and specific situations influence later legal concepts of equity and discretion. The recognition that rigid application of rules sometimes produced unjust outcomes, leading to consideration of individual circumstances, became embedded in many legal traditions. Medieval practices, while vastly different in specifics, reflected similar underlying principles. The architectural legacy of castle justice remains literally embedded in surviving structures. Tourists visiting medieval castles encounter the chambers, towers, and spaces that once served these purposes. These physical remnants provide tangible connections to past practices, helping modern observers understand that grand stone structures served complex social functions beyond simple residence and defence. Documentary records from castle courts and administrative proceedings provide invaluable historical sources. Stewards' accounts, legal records, and administrative documents offer windows into medieval life, preserving details about how communities functioned, what problems arose, and how they were addressed. Historians mining these sources continually deepen understanding of medieval society. Literary references to castle justice in medieval and later literature shaped cultural understanding. Chronicles, romances, poems, and later historical works all contributed to collective memory of how medieval society functioned. While often romanticised or dramatised, these literary sources influenced how successive generations understood their cultural inheritance. The evolution from castle-based justice to centralised legal systems marked major historical transitions. As royal authority strengthened and nation-states developed, justice moved increasingly from local lords' hands to royal courts and eventually to modern judicial systems. Understanding castle justice helps illuminate this long transformation and why it mattered so profoundly. Modern historical research, increasingly sophisticated in methods and scope, continues revealing new insights about castle justice. Archaeological investigations, careful analysis of documentary sources, and interdisciplinary approaches combining history, sociology, and anthropology deepen understanding. Each generation of scholars adds nuance and detail to the picture, moving beyond simplistic narratives toward more complex comprehension. Public fascination with medieval life, evident in countless books, films, and television programs, often features castle justice, sometimes accurately, sometimes wildly distorted. This popular interest, while varying in quality, keeps medieval history alive in cultural consciousness and drives continued scholarly investigation. The interplay between academic study and popular interest shapes how medieval justice is remembered and understood. Educational use of castle justice in teaching about medieval society serves important purposes. Understanding how these communities functioned, what they valued, and how they addressed problems helps students grasp that different historical periods operated under different assumptions and structures. The strangeness of medieval justice compared to modern systems highlights historical change and cultural variability. Ethical debates about justice, punishment, and rehabilitation often reference historical practices for comparison. Medieval approaches, with their emphasis on community, public acknowledgement, and restoration, sometimes offer contrast to modern practices that emphasize incarceration and isolation. These comparisons, while requiring careful attention to context, can illuminate both historical and contemporary issues. The preservation of castle structures themselves creates ongoing connections to this heritage. organisations dedicated to maintaining historic sites ensure that future generations can encounter these spaces physically, walking through rooms that once served as centres of medieval justice. This preservation work sustains tangible links to the past. Professional historians of medieval justice continue uncovering new sources, developing better interpretations and challenging established understandings. Recent decades have seen particular growth in understanding how medieval justice actually functioned in practice rather than just in theory. This scholarship, while academic, gradually influences broader historical understanding through teaching and popular writing. The contrast between medieval and modern approaches highlights how much has changed, while also revealing underlying continuities. Both medieval and modern societies grapple with maintaining order, addressing transgressions, and balancing individual rights against communal needs. The specific solutions differ dramatically, but the fundamental challenges remain surprisingly consistent across centuries. Understanding castle justice requires avoiding both romanticisation and demonisation. These were neither ideal systems nor simply cruel and barbaric. They were practical responses developed by real communities addressing genuine challenges, shaped by their historical moment's beliefs, values, and material conditions. Fair assessment requires understanding context while also recognising limitations. The legacy ultimately encompasses both what medieval castle justice can teach about that historical period and what it reveals about ongoing human challenges. How do communities maintain order? How should authorities balance different considerations? How can people who transgress be reintegrated? These questions lack simple answers, and examining how different societies at different times addressed them enriches understanding of their complexity. Standing at the end of this journey through the shadowed corridors and sunlit courtyards of medieval castles, certain patterns emerge that help make sense of what at first appears strange or even incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The systems of justice maintained within castle walls reflected a world fundamentally different from our own, yet grappling with challenges that remain familiar. Medieval people understood that communities couldn't function without order. With hundreds living in close quarters, sharing resources, and depending on one another, clear expectations and consistent responses to problems weren't luxuries but necessities. The systems that developed represented accumulated wisdom about human nature, group dynamics, and the challenges of communal life. The emphasis on visibility in medieval justice reflected understanding that consequences served not just individuals but entire communities. When everyone knew what resulted from different behaviours, when standards were reinforced through observable outcomes, the entire community understood what was expected. This transparency served educational and regulatory functions that private justice couldn't achieve. Status distinctions, so prominent in medieval justice, seem alien to societies that at least theoretically value equality. Yet these distinctions reflected medieval social reality, where different people genuinely held different roles, responsibilities, and capabilities. The challenge wasn't treating everyone identically, but ensuring that everyone fulfilled their appropriate function in maintaining social order. The integration of spiritual and temporal concerns in medieval justice reveals worldview where these spheres weren't separate. Medieval people didn't distinguish between earthly law and divine will in the way modern secular societies do. Justice that addressed behaviour while ignoring spiritual dimensions would have seemed incomplete, missing essential aspects of human nature and community life. Restoration's prominence in medieval castle justice reflected practical wisdom. Communities needed all capable members contributing effectively. Permanently excluding everyone who stumbled would have depleted the castle's workforce and created outsiders with nothing to lose from further transgressions. Providing paths back to good standing served everyone's interests better than inflexible exclusion. The architectural embedding of justice spaces within castle structures demonstrated how thoroughly these functions integrated into medieval life. Justice wasn't something separate, housed in special buildings apart from daily existence. It was part of the castle's very bones, woven into the same structures that protected, housed, and sustained the community. And medieval approaches to different types of transgressions reveal priorities and values. The severity of responses correlated with threat to social order and hierarchy, rather than simply harm caused. Disrespect to authority, Challenges to establish structure and behaviours threatening community cohesion drew serious responses because they endangered the foundation upon which everything else rested. The personal nature of medieval justice, with authority figures who knew those involved and understood specific circumstances, contrasts with modern bureaucratic systems. This personalisation allowed flexibility and consideration of individual situations, but also created opportunities for favouritism and inconsistency. Medieval people accepted these trade-offs, valuing the benefits of personal justice while recognising its limitations. The role of witnesses and community participation in medieval justice created shared responsibility for maintaining order. Justice wasn't simply something authorities did to individuals, but a communal process involving many people in various capacities. This participation reinforced that order was everyone's concern, and that the community bore collective responsibility for its maintenance. The gradual nature of restoration processes showed sophisticated understanding that genuine change took time. Medieval authorities recognised that completing immediate consequences didn't automatically transform behaviour. Real improvement required sustained demonstration of change, support during transition, and community acceptance that couldn't be mandated but had to develop organically. The economic dimensions of medieval castle life profoundly influenced justice. Fines, compensation, and restitution acknowledged that transgressions often had material consequences, requiring material responses. Medieval people, living closer to subsistence than modern developed world inhabitants, understood keenly that actions affecting property and resources had serious implications. The preservation of dignity, even within systems that modern eyes see as harsh, deserves recognition. Medieval justice, at its best, sought to correct behaviour while allowing people to maintain their place in community. Public acknowledgement of transgressions was balanced by public recognition of successful restoration. The goal was maintaining order while preserving the social fabric. The integration of practical concerns with theoretical principles characterised medieval approaches. Justice needed to address real problems facing actual communities, not simply apply abstract rules. This pragmatism, while sometimes creating apparent inconsistencies, ensured that responses served their intended purposes of maintaining order and community harmony. The long-term nature of castle communities, where people lived together across decades and generations, shaped justice approaches. Authorities couldn't simply exclude everyone problematic, because these individuals were woven into the community's fabric through family, work, and relationships. Solutions needed to work over the long term, not just address immediate situations. The relative rarity of serious transgressions, based on surviving records, suggests that medieval castle justice succeeded in its primary purpose. Most people, most of the time, behaved appropriately. The systems existed not to constantly correct misbehaviour, but to address the occasional problems that arose, with their very existence encouraging proper conduct. The influence of religious thought on medieval justice extended beyond specific practices to underlying assumptions about human nature, free will, and moral responsibility. Christian theology taught that people could choose between right and wrong, that redemption was possible, and that mercy should temper justice. These beliefs shaped how medieval communities approached transgressions and restoration. The physical environment of castles, with their thick walls, isolated chambers, and hierarchical spaces, naturally lent itself to certain justice practices. The architecture didn't just house justice, but shaped how it functioned. Understanding these physical realities helps explain why medieval practices took the forms they did. The evolution of castle justice over the medieval period reflected broader social changes. Early medieval practices, more informal and personal, gradually became more systematic as administrative capabilities increased. By late medieval times, some castles maintained detailed records and followed more standardized procedures, pointing toward early modern developments. The relationship between castle justice and broader legal systems varied by region and period. Some lords held extensive rights to administer justice autonomously. Others operated within frameworks established by kings or other higher authorities. These variations remind us that medieval castle justice wasn't a single uniform system, but rather a family of related practices adapted to local circumstances. The human dimension of castle justice, easily lost in discussions of structures and procedures, deserves constant attention. real people experienced these systems, some as authorities making difficult decisions, others as those requiring correction, many as witnesses and community members supporting both order and mercy. Their experiences, while distant, connect across centuries to ongoing human struggles with justice. As candles gutter and the hour grows late, this journey through the shadowed and sunlit spaces of medieval castle justice reaches its natural conclusion. The stone walls that witnessed these dramas still stand in many places, patient monuments to human efforts across centuries to maintain order, address wrongdoing and preserve communities. Medieval castle inhabitants, living in circumstances foreign to modern experience, developed systems that worked for their time and situation. They grappled with challenges that remained familiar: how to maintain order in close-knit communities, how to address those who transgressed expectations, how to balance consequences with opportunities for restoration, how to make justice serve both individuals and society. Their solutions, products of medieval worldview and material conditions, differ dramatically from modern approaches, yet examining them offers valuable perspective. Understanding how other times and places addressed perennial challenges enriches comprehension of our own systems and assumptions. History serves not as simple guide to present, but as mirror revealing that multiple approaches to fundamental problems have existed. The castle ruins and restored structures that dot European landscapes carry within their stones memories of these systems. Walking through them, passing doorways that once led to justice chambers, climbing towers that held secure rooms, standing in courtyards where proceedings occurred, creates tangible connection to this heritage. The stones themselves bear witness. Modern visitors to these sites often focus on military history, architectural grandeur, or romantic elements of castle life. Yet the quieter story of how these communities governed themselves, maintained order, and addressed human failings forms equally important parts of their history. Every castle was both fortress and community, both military installation and home to complex social system. The people who inhabited these castles, from lords to servants, from knights to craftspeople, were neither heroes nor villains but humans navigating the circumstances of their lives. They made mistakes, learned lessons, supported one another, and built communities that sustained them through challenges. Their stories, preserved imperfectly in documents and embedded in architecture, remind us of shared humanity across centuries. The legacy of medieval castle justice extends beyond historical curiosity into ongoing conversations about how societies should address wrongdoing, maintain order, and support both community welfare and individual dignity. While methods change, underlying questions persist. History doesn't provide answers, but it does offer perspective, showing that societies have always struggled with these challenges and found varying solutions. As dawn approaches and this night's journey ends, perhaps what remains most clearly is appreciation for the complexity of medieval life. These weren't simple times populated by simple people. Castle communities developed sophisticated approaches to difficult challenges, drawing on accumulated wisdom, adapting to circumstances, and building systems that sustained them across generations. The stones of medieval castles continue standing, patient guardians of memory. They witnessed everything, the grand events that made history books and the quiet daily struggles that shaped actual lives. In their shadows and sunlight, in their towers and courtyards, in their great halls and hidden chambers, human dramas played out that echo still. Thank you for joining this exploration of how European castles maintain justice within their walls. May the insights gained illuminate both medieval history and the ongoing human challenges of building and maintaining communities where order and mercy, consequence and restoration, structure and flexibility find balance. The stones remember, and in remembering, they teach. Until next time, rest well.